My first trip to South Korea was a very powerful moment, especially for the country there. What happened around my trip to South Korea during that time was that there was a huge incident where hundreds of kids drowned in the water with this ferry boat. The whole nation was mourning, and that happened pretty much around my trip there, and it really changed very much the nature of my trip there. In the beginning, I had this kind of celebratory anticipation about going to South Korea and to meet with some of my friends and also to have good time enjoying the landscapes there. There's a wonderful, beautiful, magical mountains and their cuisine, historical sites. I also remember that I was scheduled to give a talk on a specific topic at this temple somewhere in city of Seoul, and I had to change my tone or the language from the plan that I had for that living and talk because the whole nation there was really impacted by that incident. Everyone was impacted. All the people who have been organizing my event and everybody on the streets at the airport, including visitors, someone like me. Everyone was impacted by that incident to the extent that I felt I need to speak in a way that such a reality is not ignored. Many of the participants are living in United States. It's a country that has many fronts. It's a great nation. It is a nation that it's one of those few nations that has a multi culture and where relatively people can and practice their faith without being persecuted. So in that sense, the US culture is a melting pot culture, and many people from all the world dream of coming to United States as a sanctuary, lot of refugees, political refugees, and even economic refugees have the dream to make it to United States as some kind of promised land. And there's truth in it, but it is history is very mixed as there's a history of welcoming people from all over the world. And not only that, the culture of United States empowers people to be creative, and to feel that they have the right environment to be who they are, to express individualism and also their creativity. And that's why many of the inventions, the greatest inventions, actually come from United States, such as the aeroplane. But the history is also very mixed with the violence, aggression, the slavery and exploitation of the indigenous people. The list of violence just keeps going, and it is still continuing with this almost unspoken mountain of rage, hatred, and prejudice. And therefore, many people who are living in the United States right now are totally impacted by this instances that is happening right now. You may have read the news. It's a very big news. This incident happened not very long time ago. George Floyd, this African American man, was basically killed by police brutality. And then I think we're all very much impacted by that, regardless of who we are. Either we are in the retreat or we are just living our ordinary life, or maybe we are writing a book or meditating on compassion or non-duality or great emptiness. But we are very much impacted, which is totally understandable. Usually, when those powerful event happens in the world, it has, of course, global impact, but especially it has a very powerful impact on your consciousness when it happens to your country or to your state or to your neighborhood. When those events happens, and especially close a perspective, and there's a very powerful impact on your system. Right now, I'm living in this wonderful city, this wonderful area, the San Francisco Bay Area. I live not too far away from the city of Berkeley, and the Northern California. So personally, I and many of my friends are very much impacted by this instance. In the same way, I was very much impacted by that instance in South Korea when I was visiting there as a traveler, even though in this lifetime I'm not a Korean, but I really feel such strong affinity with the people in South Korea. And then when we are impacted, the question is how we are going to respond. And this is also an opportunity for us to become a bodhisattva, the awakened heroine and the hero. And let's say everything's going well, perhaps in your life, and the life seems to be quite normal. and you are maybe reading your favorite novel, and maybe you're on the seventh chapter of your favorite novel, and then you are kind of continuing this daily routine that has solace, and suddenly this powerful event happens in the external world, and that totally bring about some kind of disruption to the continuation of your comfortable life with so much solace, in a way that we are totally impacted. We just can't pretend that everything is a hunky-dory and continue that daily life based on the solace and the comfort. And then now the question is, how are we going to respond to those events? We could respond from hatred, or we can respond from courage and compassion. But again, compassion is not passive. Compassion is actually very active and dynamic. Compassion often inspires us to not just sit around, but to take the right action and to change the world, and where we can maybe transcend or maybe let go of this old hatred, violence, and to bring about more peace, healing, unity, especially healing. I one time wrote all these so-called dohas, songs of realization, based on the Dzogchen teachings, or the wisdom of non-duality, or the absolute truth. And it's important for us to also tune into the absolute truth, and that teaches that the life is pretty much the transcend our hope and fear, and recognize that the personal self is illusion. We are one with everything, and there's no good and bad. Everything's already perfect, enlightened, and that is the pretty much the absolute truth, which is valid in itself, and therefore it's very liberating for us to connect and tap into the absolute truth. Otherwise, everything becomes so heavy and rigid in this lifetime, just becomes too rigid to the extent that life is sometimes just too heavy. But by tuning into the absolute truth, we can experience this unconditioned and unconditional freedom in the midst of everything, while we are going through all the motions of life, ups and downs. And that's where that we can ground ourselves in this unshakable freedom and inner liberation, regardless of what is happening outside in the external world. So I wrote all these dohas based on the non-dual wisdom of Dzogchen, because I really felt that maybe that's the only way we can be free to the inside. And then I presented these dohas, songs of realizations, to my friends and my spiritual colleagues, such as the Tibetan lamas. One of the lama looked at my dohas, songs of realizations, and he said, well, your ratans are very beautiful, but maybe you should talk about compassion, because so far in your poems, the compassion is not mentioned, only the absolute truth, dharmakaya, emptiness, Buddha mind are mentioned. He said these are all wonderful, but maybe you have to make sure that compassion is included. His simple comment really brought a huge shift in my mind. It's almost like I came to this realization that how important the compassion and love and courage are in our own spiritual journey. And if compassion and courage are ignored somehow because they are inconvenient for our ego, and then all our adventure into the so-called awareness, enlightenment, awakening, as well as all our beautiful, fancy spiritual practices that might be whatever, Zen or mindfulness or some kind of Tantra, they all really don't have the power, the potential to truly change our consciousness. So his comment was like eye-opening to me, even though he was my friend, he wasn't my former official spiritual teacher, but kind of secretly I regarded him as my mentor or my spiritual teacher, because just what he said in that very simple comment one time really made a huge impact on my understanding of what Dharma, what spirituality is. And so now we are impacted. When we are impacted, then naturally we tend to not sit around, and we tend to respond or react as a bodhisattva, as a yogi. We do not want to respond with a more lower state of consciousness, but we want to respond from compassion and courage. I heard this inspiring story many, many years ago, which keeps coming back. There's a very famous Cambodian monk was living somewhere, and he invited all these Cambodian refugees who lost their loved ones in a war, in civil war, and that was initiated by the Khmer Rouge regime, and that regime took life of around 1 million people. It was one of the darkest moments in human history. And then this monk invited, perhaps Mahakosananda, right? Invited all these Cambodians and told them he's going to do a ceremony for the dead and to honor them. And people had perhaps this idea that he's going to do some formal ceremony to honor the dead, but instead he invited everybody and he started chanting this verse from Dharmabhada, which goes something like this: hatred only breeds hatred, love alone heals. And he started chanting that verse, and he invited everybody to join him to chant that verse. There wasn't any ceremony, but that was the ceremony. And he just kept reciting for perhaps hours, and then everybody had to join him and chanted and that verse. So what he was really trying to say is that when we feel we are impacted by violence, injustice, or the ugly side of the humanity, if we react with the hatred, and then what we do is we just continue to feed the hatred. It's like pouring oil on the fire, and what that is ignite more division and more hatred. And therefore he's saying that the healing and the peace can be brought about if we have the courage to love and to open heart and to show compassion, even though it's so challenging for our ego. You can see that some of this incidents that happened in the last few days is a really manifestation of hatred and prejudice, and that are very much part of the human consciousness, especially also in this context, the American consciousness, something we cannot deny. And somehow our ego is really addicted to hatred and anger, and in a strange way, not always, the human ego feels kind of almost powerful, strong, self-righteous, and also almost like can be a little bit intoxicated from indulging in the anger, prejudice, because the ego feel that now that I'm strong, I'm powerful, I'm right. So it's very almost addictive for the ego to really indulge in the anger and the hatred, even though in the end we all know that hatred, anger create only misery for oneself. There's no really pure joy and happiness in the realm of hatred, anger, but for maybe a while, sometimes it's like people can be almost like intoxicated, literally. People can have some kind of high from indulging in the anger and the hatred to give it the sense of being right, being powerful, or being strong, or also feel being superior in relationship to maybe another person. And this is why, beside having total delusion, ignorance towards nature of the reality, but also there's this addictive experience happens when people sometimes indulge in the anger and hatred. That's why I think whenever there's instances, we need to look into all the psychological makeup behind those instances. I remember this very famous American novelist, James Baldwin. He had many wonderful sayings. One of my favorite quote from him goes something like this. Perhaps you may need to look to find the right version of the quotation. But in essence, he said something like this: the reason people are stubbornly holding on to hatred is that they know once hatred goes away, then they have to deal with the pain. This is a really powerful and wise saying or statement on why human beings are so much attached to anger, hatred, because sometimes the anger, hatred not only give people some kind of psychological high, but also it becomes this unhealthy defensive to shield your heart so we don't have to maybe feel fallen apart or maybe grief and the pain, humility, humble, and also sometimes to really recognize one's own anger, hatred, and knowing and one's shadow can be very humiliating to the ego, and therefore sometimes the process of healing can be painful because one has to admit one's own shadow. So this is a moment for all of us and to go high, right? And when you read the news, which you will be doing these days, it seems an inevitable part of life. Many years ago, before the smartphone became popular, you all know who she is, Giovanna Messi. She is one of the heroines of ecological movement. She came to this meditation center in the Santa Cruz Mountains, where I lived at one time, and she rented their center as venue for her a retreat, her workshop. And this was many, many years ago. I don't think cell phone was popular at that time. Maybe a few people had smartphones, or there wasn't really smartphones at that time, but they had this little cell phone, perhaps which you remember, but only a few people had that cell phone. And then I remember that one of the people were saying that their spiritual practice is to read the news every morning. And at that time, maybe the news are not so available as now, so you kind of have to make a special effort to read the news. The effort, and the time has been changed. At that time, like reading news was like spiritual thing, something you really have to exert effort, and now like there's almost like too much news all the time to the extent that we cannot escape from it, and therefore sometimes very healing to our body and mind to just unplug from everything and everything, right? And go into wilderness, just stay in silence and watch the sunrise and sunset. And if you can do meditation, it would be good. But even you can do any spiritual practices, just being in the nature is so healing these days because we are bombarded by social media and news. So there's kind of balance between indulging in the news and social media versus not to run away from the reality and to also pay attention to what is really happening in the world. So there's really this very fine balance, which is very tricky and difficult to practice once you know, open your smartphone and then there's all this news, and some of them are very necessary to pay attention to, such as the instances happening right now in the United States, and sure, this kind of unfortunate instances are happening all over the world. So it's important that we widen our awareness and to realize that this kind of suffering and misery are happening everywhere all over the world, not just in your country or in your city. And sometimes it's easy to forget there's a whole world. So this is a maybe moment for us, especially those who live in the United States, to take this a whole unfortunate instance as a to wake up and to just realize that there's a sea of suffering in the world. And it's not a novel, it's not like a new development. It has been there, but somehow when it is manifested in such a powerful instances, it calls our attention, calls our awareness. So this is maybe a time to invoke some of the sacred archetypes, because it's kind of hard to sometimes open your heart and to respond with compassion when this kind of unfortunate violent instance happens in your country or in your neighborhood or in your city. But maybe, at least in my experience, invoking the sacred archetypes can be really wonderful way to learn how to be totally in touch with the reality and not close your heart to even the ugly aspect of the world, but yet be totally grounded at center of your being and just pour love and compassion to the humanity, but not to feed the hatred by hatred. One of the sacred archetype that we invoke is this Avalokiteshvara. There has many forms. The four-armed Avalokiteshvara, or the 1,000 armed Avalokiteshvara. When you look at the sacred image of Avalokiteshvara, he or she doesn't really matter. Avalokiteshvara does not have any gender, and that's why in Chinese Buddhism, Avalokiteshvara is the Kuan Yin. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Avalokiteshvara is being illustrated as this a male Buddha or Bodhisattva. And when you invoke the sacred archetype of either Kuan Yin or Avalokiteshvara, you feel that the Avalokiteshvara is completely open-hearted, and Avalokiteshvara is aware fully of the tragedies, pain, and sorrow of the entire world. And that's why in some form of Avalokiteshvara, he has 1,000 eyes, which is the representation of this totally wide heart, the open heart, with the eye of compassion, and that sees fearlessly the tragedies, the violence, the sorrow, the pain, the poverty of the humanity and the world. And yet you can really feel energetic that Avalokiteshvara is not angry, neither he is depressed, neither he is despondent. You know, sometimes whenever I have a difficulty to just take in all the suffering of the world and not react with my whatever lower state of consciousness, but with love, compassion, then I try to invoke the image of Avalokiteshvara, which works on me because I have been practicing Avalokiteshvara sadhana, partly because I'm a Tibetan. In Tibet, especially in Nyingma lineage, we talk about the three protectors of the land of snow. These are Avalokiteshvara, Aryatara, and Padmasambhava Rinpoche. So for Nyingmapas, the people in my tradition, we regard those three Buddhas as the protectors of the land of snow. And so we tend to invoke one of those deities, even though Avalokiteshvara nor Tara reside outside of consciousness. In the times of confusion and times of darkness, we invoke them. And for many people, they find immediate peace and healing and resolution simply invoking those sacred archetypes. Not only that, when our heart is totally open, we can embrace those who are hurt and those who are disfranchised, those who are abused, but we can also hold those who hurt others, those who inflict pain on others in that open heart, because we know that often when people inflict pain on others, not because they're bad, but because they are also conditioned culturally, and they're also dealing their own pain, as James Baldwin pointed out. They're dealing some kind of pain inside, and whatever that pain might be coming from, that pain could be coming from some kind of shame or guilt, a guilt that has been transmitted by their parents or their parents, and guilt, shame about things happened in the even the history of the past, or maybe again the hatred or anger, prejudice give them sense of being in some sense superior and maybe even right, and they can even feel that remember psychological high, like feel big and strong and powerful, and deep down, maybe underneath of them, they're just like anybody else. They're really feeling lots of pain of shame, guilt, self-doubt, insecurity. And when you look from that point of view, it's a difficulty not to hold everybody equally in our heart. So we are going to have this ceremony, end of the day. You may have already heard that announcement. The ceremony is called the butter lamp prayer. I hope that many of you can participate in it. And this would be like the perfect ceremony to do right now. It's a ceremony for world peace, healing, forgiveness, and also prayer that the whole humanity will wake up and go to the light, go to the love, and let go of the ignorance, let go of the hatred, let go of the all our old karmic patterns that make us to react with a very primitive state of consciousness. I was planning to talk about something else this morning, about consciousness, no self-emptiness, but in some sense they're all really connected with each other, this very topic, because there's no awakening, no nirvana, there's no self, and there's no emptiness or dharmakaya without the authentic compassion and courage. It's all connected with each other. So we are living in a very powerful time, and it's a whole new era where the world seems to be unstable and quite volatile. And perhaps the world has been like this for a long time. There was always violence, war, or between tribes throughout history, but somehow energetically it feels extremely volatile right now. And this is not just the experience of few individuals, but this is a experience that many people are going through right now, not just in this part of the world. I talk to people in Asia, especially in Tibet. Even people in Tibet were experiencing that the time is very different. I think people in Asia experienced a sense of peace to a certain extent in 1990s, 1980s. But somehow, whatever with maybe the social media, it seems that many people are feeling that the whole world is very much right now volatile. Maybe that's just our perception. Maybe things has been like this all along from the dawn of a civilization. But definitely with the wide use of social media, we are very connected with each other, and we are bombarded by almost every incidents, big and little information taking place in the world, and that's why it's very easy for us to be challenged, confused, even neurologically. And there are many crises happening right now: political crisis, ecological crisis. So if we are not ready to prepare this kind of time of confusion, uncertainty, and where world is volatile, and then we are going to be perhaps challenged all the time, and therefore we are pretty much called, and we are in many ways encouraged to be ready to prepare how to deal with this kind of wild time. And those news about crisis, ecological crisis, political instability, or injustice are going to really upset us. And to the extent that would almost, in some sense, seduce us to react from the lowest level of our consciousness, which is hatred, judging. Somewhere I read recently there's even a term coined by somebody in a newspaper called the pleasure of hating. Is very addictive. Again, feels we are right, we are on the right side when we hate other people. So it's very addictive. And what has really happened in that moment is just the ego hijacked our consciousness completely. So this is a time that we need to prepare to learn how to be grounded at the center of our being and to have a more equilibrium and not to easily exclude other people from our heart, regardless of who they are, regardless of their political ideology might be, regardless of their belief systems. Otherwise, I think this wild time is going to throw us off the balance all the time, each day, and that won't be very wise way to live. Will be totally lost in this group of our ego, and will be reacting constantly. And therefore, it is time for all of us to be ready to respond to the world from the ground of equilibrium and open heart. And when we know how to respond to the world and all the events in the world from that place, then we will know how to respond to our own immediate environment. And we will be responding to people around us, to our loved ones, to our family members, to our friends from that place, from equilibrium and open heart. In the end, there will be healing in your life, healing for the world. I'm not saying that we just have to invoke those sacred archetypes to go that place where there's equilibrium and compassion when those big major instances happens in the world through social media. But this is an invitation for us to be the Avalokiteshvara all the time, even there's no big Tara, and to respond all the time to our loved ones, people in our life, and to hold them in our heart and respond to them. Respond to them as much you can from that place. And hold them, embrace them in your open heart. It's not like we have to wait for some another major news of catastrophe to be Avalokiteshvara. I think life is constantly presenting us each moment to be the Avalokiteshvara.